Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I truly hope you're safe and sound. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of discussions on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, I'm truly pleased and honored to welcome to the program Congresswoman Mikie Sherrill, who proudly represents New Jersey's 11th district as a Democrat and also sits on the House Armed Services Committee. Congresswoman, welcome to Carnegie Connects.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Terrific. You know, you have such an impressive and unique resume that I want to spend a minute just acquainting our viewers with it, because I have a few questions about the issue of public service, which is important to me, and I hope would be important to many others as well. After graduating from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1994, you spent almost 10 years on active duty in the U.S. Navy, flying missions throughout Europe and the Middle East as a Sea King helicopter pilot. You worked on the battle watch floor of the European theater during the Iraq invasion, and you served as a flag aide to the Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. You also served as a Russian policy officer and worked on the implementation of U.S. nuclear treaty obligations. You then went to Georgetown Law School, and you had a stint in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And then, well, along the way, you also had time to get a master's degree in global history from London School of Economics and Political Science. And then you made an important decision, and I want to talk to you about that in a minute, to enter politics writ large, which is not for everyone. But I wanted to start, I mean, where did this desire, this commitment to public service come from?
That's a great question. I think that growing up in this country, when I did during the Cold War, there was, in my mind, an understanding that in a democracy, everyone had a commitment to some sort of public service. And that doesn't mean wearing the uniform or entering into government. It can also mean giving back to your community in some way, shape, or form. But this is our country. We've built it together, and that gives us certain rights, but it gives us certain responsibilities. And I think that is not discussed today as much as it should be, that necessity of people to engage in our government as it was, I think, when I was growing up.
So there was no family history of career military or public service? It didn't come from, you weren't inspired by mother's, father's, grandparents?
I was, certainly. My grandfather was a B-24 pilot in World War II and was shot down. And I always wanted to fly. In fact, when I told my father I wanted to fly, he said I had to go in the military because it was too expensive. Flight lessons were too expensive. And that is where I initially had the idea of going to the Naval Academy. And so that was definitely something that I think was modeled for me. But, it wasn't just that I went into the military. One of my sisters went into teaching and became an educator. Another sister of mine works on water issues throughout the community, which she's really been dedicated to, and providing clean drinking water. So there are a million different ways you can serve, but I think that idea that in some way, shape, or form, because we are being raised in a country that has more to offer than any other nation on earth to its citizens, we also have a debt to pay to that country and to our community members. And as I said, it doesn't mean you have to go serve in the military. It doesn't mean you have to even perform a job in public service, but it does mean, I think, that you have to look for those opportunities to serve your community.
Yeah. I mean, your entire career reinforces, my own sense about the importance of turning the M in me upside down so it becomes the W in we. I just find that the folks who I've been around them for most of my professional life, who are the most fulfilled in their professions and careers, are those that tether themselves to things that are broader, larger, and frankly, more important than themselves. So so I think you answered my question already. You chose the military because you wanted to fly. I mean, you could have, become a pilot for United Airlines, but why the military?
Well, it was that sense of service. It was, as you suggested, it had been modeled to me by my grandfather. Growing up during the Cold War, there was a sense of duty to our nation and to promote our democratic values and to protect our democratic values. And the military was the way to do that. The wall fell when I was a senior in high school, so I had made the determination I wanted to go to the Naval Academy, and the world was changing at that time. But certainly that atmosphere as I was growing up lent itself to this ideal of service.
And the 10 years you spent in the Navy in various capacities, how did it change and or shape your values or your views? What did military service provide? It's unique and very special. I mean, we have a volunteer military. I want to talk to you about that in a little bit later, but what did it teach you, and how did it change you? I know there's no I in team. It's a wonderful expression, however hackneyed it may be. It happens to be true, but how did it change you?
That, there are so many ways. I would say one of the ways that's been really meaningful to me is when you go to the Naval Academy, you go to a college with people from every single state in the nation, and some who've come from overseas where their parents have been serving. You go to school with people from some of our nation's top private boarding schools where the kind of the height of privilege you can be seen on those campuses. And then you also go to school, it's a free education. And so you also go to school with people who, if they had not gotten into the service academy, might not have been able to go to college. And so you see kind of that diverse array of people from across our nation. You also then graduate and immediately go into the fleet, where you are serving with men and women who are, as you're an officer, if you're an officer in the Navy, serving with men and women often who haven't completed a college degree, who the military was one of the few opportunities in their town that they had. And so you interact with people from all parts of this country. And I think what you realize is how similar you are. Even if you have the most different backgrounds you can imagine, you're both there because you're in service to the country. You both have the same missions. You're taking care of other people. You're working together on that goal. And I think that's something that the military teaches you. It also, for me, I remember reading, and this was probably when I was a senior in high school, an op-ed by someone from Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Forum, that women should not be in combat and they shouldn't be in aviation. And it was just too harsh on she had gone up in some sort of aircraft, and it was just, too hard on her. And I remember as a high school kid who wanted to go be an aviator being incredibly offended by this. And I remember kind of scathingly saying to, my sister or something, well, I'm so glad they asked this woman and not an aviation physiologist who could actually give us some insight into whether or not this is a good idea. But I was just, at that time thinking, I'm going to make sure that our military allows women in combat. And to get to the point in my senior year where we were getting briefed, because we were going to be the first ever class of women able to go into combat aviation billets, felt like such progress. And it felt like here we are in a country where these things are possible, where some of the old paradigms can be broken with dedication, and because we have access to so many things in this country to help us make the country a more perfect union. So that sense of momentum was really important, and seeing things change. I remember the chief of naval operations was asked when I was at the Naval Academy, Admiral, when will women be on submarines? And he scathingly said, and again, I was so offended, not in my lifetime. And he got a standing ovation by the Brigade of Midshipmen. You fast forward to today when women are serving on submarines. In fact, the USS New Jersey is the first purpose-built attack submarine to have women berthed on it. I'm a congresswoman from New Jersey, so I had to get that in there.
Sure.
But this is the momentum we see just in the fleet. Don't ask, don't tell has been overturned. So much movement to create a more fair military and a more fair society, really. And those have been some of the critical lessons that I've taken with me. And then you find when you're in the middle of your career and you get to be a little bit older, you sort of realize that a lot of the lessons you learned very early on that you didn't even realize impacted you. I have to say that before I ran for Congress, if you asked any number of people I was with on the side of a soccer field or at a PTA meeting, I don't think most of them knew I'd served in the military. It wasn't something I considered to be obvious or that I talked about or that I thought about how it impacted me. But as I've gone forward, I've realized that way of thinking, that way of being able to attack problems, of being able to bring very different people together in one mission really has inculcated the way I think about so many different issues that I face largely, but specifically here in Congress.
Yeah. I mean, you're preaching to the converted. I think it's so important. Before we leave the military piece of this, what is it like to fly a Sea King helicopter, and how do Sea Kings differ from Cobras or any of the other helicopters that the Navy deploys?
So they're fantastic helicopters, but they're about to be phased out. In fact, I think the last squadron is HMX-1, which is, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Sea King, it is the helicopter that the president flies in. So if you see Marine One landing at the White House, that is an H-3 Sea King helicopter. And they're about to switch over to a new version. In fact, I just saw it flying on the Hill the other day. So they're already doing test flights. I think it's already following the new version is already following the Sea King around. So they're preparing to change that out really shortly. But it's fantastic. It has a boat hull. So it can land on the water, which I always appreciated, because something you have to do as a helicopter pilot in the Navy is go through the helicopter dunker, which to date is one of my most hated experiences. You strap into this makeshift helicopter, and in some iterations of this, you're blindfolded. You're dropped into this pool of water and flipped upside down, and then you have to swim out. And I am telling you, I've been a swimmer my entire life. I was on swim team throughout my childhood. I'm very comfortable in the water. Being strapped into a mock-up of a helicopter and blindfolded and turned upside down and then having to swim out was horrific. I hated it. And you had to do it. You had to kind of re-up your qualifications, I think every 4 years. And every time it got worse and worse and worse.
Yeah. I mean, I'm having visions of Top Gun and An Officer and a Gentleman. I mean, that's an extraordinary experience. Okay. So you're out of the military. That was before law school, I'm assuming. But let's just jump to the key question. So why politics? And why politics now? I mean, we'll get to the issue of Congress in a minute, but just broadly speaking, we live in an argue culture. I mean, we suffer now from pernicious polarization where it's not just policy differences, it's personal differences have been elevated to sort of tribal differences. You know, the polls in the 60s indicated when asked whether a person would mind if their son and daughter married a Republican or Democrat, it was in the single digits. Now, when you ask that question, it's double digits and then some. So, I mean, it's a fraught enterprise these days. What of all the possible career paths after the military and law school, why politics?
Well, thank God things used to be different, because my mom was a Democrat and my dad was a Republican when they married. So I'm glad we made it in under the wire in my family. Yeah, it's, I wouldn't have gotten into politics except for the situation we find ourselves in. It's not as if this was a long time plan and we're just, this is the time that I was able to enter into them. In fact, I did not think I would be doing this. When I first told my husband I think I should run for Congress in 2017, I assumed he'd say, "You definitely don't have to run for Congress. We have 4 children and we live in New Jersey. This is a bad idea." Instead, he said, "Yeah, I think you do." He comes from that same background of service and served in the military as well with me. So I think it was actually this sense that things feel broken to many of us, that things don't feel like they're working like they should be, that values that we were raised with that we sort of thought everyone shared are being undermined right now. And it's happening in a couple ways. I think Trump has inculcated this kind of victimhood culture where everyone's got a grievance and everyone's a victim. And if you're a victim, by definition, there is somebody victimizing you. And he has sort of created this sense of tribalism in our country, this sense that, it's everything should be about you and what you are able to get for yourself and maybe your close family and friends, but people who aren't like you, other people, are trying to take from you. And that couldn't be further from what you learn in the military or how I feel like I was brought up in this country and the values that we had of being a very diverse nation. And because of that, being the most innovative and having the most opportunity and welcoming people to take part in this great democratic experiment. And to see that undermining of things that have made us strong is so upsetting. That's why, this conversation is so interesting to me, because I was just having a similar conversation yesterday at Georgetown Law School, where I graduated from, speaking to young law students about their careers, their future, what they might consider. And it really occurred to me, as I looked out on these young people who were very optimistic and had a great sense of it, I said, when asked kind of what is the advice for the future, I said, something, when I look out on people who are at Georgetown Law School, something good has happened in their life to land them there, whether it was a great education system, a great family support system, a great job that led to that. Something led to them sitting in those seats yesterday.
Mm.
And I said, because of that good thing came somewhere in this country, and you owe this country, and you owe a debt. You owe a debt to the people that you are going to serve, because in many cases, your job is not just your job if you're in public service. Your job is your vocation. And you owe the people you're serving. You owe them guidance. You owe them leadership. We are going through changing times, whether it's AI or quantum or bioengineering. And you've got to help people navigate that if you're in a leadership position. And there are just too many people who I think want to abdicate that leadership, want to say, everybody else is against us and we just kind of need to duck down and get what's ours. And that could not be further from the ideals of this country as I see it, than anything I've seen since I've been alive.
Yeah. My son Danny's a Georgetown Law graduate as well, so I agree with you. So you not surprisingly ran toward the fight, not away from it. Use the word broken, and I think that's an apt word. My friend and the AEI scholar Norman Ornstein and Tom Mann wrote a book called The Broken Branch, and in another one 10 years later calls It's Worse Than You Think. And they describe in a political system where you only have 2 major parties, it is critically important that both parties, however much they may disagree on policy issues, function and adhere to certain standards of behavior and norms that allow, in a 2-party system, functional self-governance. So if I were to ask you, it's a very complicated question. Obviously, we can't answer all of it, but how do you repair this? I ran a program at the Woodrow Wilson Center called the Foreign Policy Fellowship Program. We brought, it's still up and running, 100 staffers, Republicans and Democrats, for a 3-hour, once a week. We got them away from the mothership, the Hill, for presentations by experts. Then we divided them into groups. We mixed them up, okay? Gave them problems to solve. And you know what? They all wanted to be smart. And they came up with solutions to problems that transcended partisan politics. Now, these are the staffers, not their bosses. But I wonder what's driving the dysfunction in your view? Why the personalization and the tribalization?
I think far right extremist Republicans, and I'm not saying that, there is perfection on the Democratic side, but I will tell you this idea of how to take apart our government and our institutions is derived from the far right extremist. And so you have polls that will say the far left wants bipartisanship, the center left wants bipartisanship, the center right wants bipartisanship, the far right doesn't. And you see that playing out now as they have sort of co-opted the party. You see it when, people have come to me so many times. Are you going to rescue the speaker? Why didn't you rescue the speaker? Why didn't you help get another speaker elected? What's going on here? And it was very clear as when Matt Gaetz had vacated the chair and the Republicans could not seem to get another speaker, that it was made very clear that the Democrats were open to supporting someone and happy to talk about it. But even the suggestion that someone's speaker candidacy might be supported by Democratic votes was enough to derail that speaker from getting the votes. I mean, it was enough to derail the campaign for speaker. Any whiff that Democrats might help. You see it when you have a bill in the Democratic majority Senate, which has a lot of a lot of the Republican wish list for some border security issues that are negotiated and agreed to by the Democratic majority. And then you have Speaker McConnell saying, this is as good as we're going to get. This is amazing. Let's pass this. And then because Trump, I think, wants to kind of use that issue as a dividing tool instead of actually solve problems or use government to fix issues, Call says kill this by sunrise, and it was dead by sunrise. These are ways in which the far right is upending the institutions of our government and basic problem solving, basically addressing the needs of the American people has become so difficult. And of course, that's the supplemental. The president proposed the supplemental in October. The Senate passed it in February. We are, now in late April, and they're at the 11th hour after we were told they'd do it last week. Suddenly they're rewriting the whole supplemental. That'll take 2 months minimum to get through the Senate. The Senate's not even in session next week. So why are we rewriting it? And it doesn't even appear like it's kind of going to the actual supplemental. It seems like this rewriting is some farcical idea of we're just going to break it up and pass it a little differently and call it our bill. I mean, look, the Ukrainians are now facing the last I've seen, I think, a 10-1 weapons advantage by the Russians. We've got to handle this now. This kind of chaos and dysfunction, when we all sort of have a majority of people in the House of Representatives who know what the path forward is and know what the solution is beyond frustrating.
I work for Republicans and Democrats and voted for them too. I just wonder, you talk about extremists on the Republican side. I just wonder why the party itself seems to be held hostage.
I think there was a lack of, leadership by people who could have done things at certain inflection points. I think now it's too late. So what I mean by that is, even in 2018, when all the moderate Republicans were leaving the House of Representatives, if instead maybe they had kind of come together and said, we're going to offer a different path forward. We may lose our seat, but we're going to go down fighting for what we believe the Republican Party stands for. that might have made a difference. I probably wouldn't be in Congress, but that would have made a difference. If when we impeached President Trump, because he tried to stay in office despite a Democratic election and sent an armed mob after people in Congress and his own vice president, if McConnell, for example, had said, we should all move forward on impeaching a president, this is so contrary to every value of democracy that has ever been stated. If McConnell had weighed in there and Republicans had stood up at that time to impeach the president, that would have been an important inflection point. I don't know if that would have worked. I don't know if anything would have worked, but these are areas where people just abdicated responsibility. And instead, I think we're hoping, oh, I'm just going to keep my head down. We'll get rid of Trump. We'll move on. It'll be fine. Instead of taking the real leadership and saying, no, nothing about this is fine. And nothing about this represents the Republican Party. And fast forward, you get to the point now where the extremist Republicans, the MAGA Republicans, Trump, have so taken over the Republican Party that if you step out of line, I don't think you have a future. And you see really weird things happening. So you see a Republican Congress with almost no majority. And yet you see someone like Ken Buck quitting, saying, I'm gone in a week. They said, oh, have you told the speaker? Oh, I left him a voicemail. That's striking. You see somebody like Mike Gallagher, who in any other Republican Party would have been the future of the party. I mean, he's telegenic, he's thoughtful, he's a combat veteran who went to Princeton. Speaking of General Petraeus, we were speaking of General Petraeus earlier. I mean, General Petraeus told me he was an American treasure. He has a young family. He's the head of the new committee that it was his brainchild. And he stood up this committee for the strategic competition with the Chinese Communist Party and had somebody like me join it in this Congress. I went up to him and I said, Mike, I don't need to be on a committee that's fighting over who's tougher on China. I want to really get stuff accomplished. He said, no, this is going to be a bipartisan committee and we're going to do really good stuff. And we have. He has now announced he's resigning. And then he did it in a way that, according to Wisconsin state laws, they can't run a special election. I mean, these are sort of important tea leaves that you can read in what's going on in the Republican Party. It shows that there is almost no way when you see people like Cheney and Kinzinger and others to, at this point, it feels like there's almost no way now to rescue it.
Yeah. You raised Ukraine, and it's a good segue into some of the issues that you're grappling with, Congress and the Hill. I want to ask you a strategic question. University of Chicago and Uppsala University in Sweden done a study that essentially has tracked every major interstate war since 1815. The average length of an interstate war since 1815 is 3 months. If a war goes on more than a year or two, we're now into almost the certainty of a multi-year confrontation. So as a strategic proposition, you have a situation where in response to this strategic problem, that this is in fact a long war. Neither side has any incentive or motivation. To talk about negotiations would be performative, if anything. We need, you would think, as a national interest above partisan politics, a strategy, maybe not a generational strategy, but one that lasts from one administration to the next and beyond. How do you see the Ukraine issue over the next year or so? Mike Johnson has split this up apparently into 4 bills. Each will be introduced separately. How does this play out? You indicated that if you have to rewrite this and it'll have to pass the Senate again, we're talking months, correct? That's a very grim assessment for the Ukrainians. You think that's how it's going to play out?
I'm really not sure how this is going to play out. You probably heard that Congressman Massey this morning said he was going to join Congresswoman Taylor Greene in the motion to vacate. So I'm really not sure how the speaker is thinking about this. It's kind of striking that he comes from the more right-wing part of the conference, the Republican conference, and yet he's sounding like somebody who is incredibly frustrated with a group of people that don't want to govern, that don't want to solve problems, that don't want to actually run the country. And I think he's seeing that firsthand, how toxic that can be. So you've asked a couple of questions. I guess, first of all, it could be if we wholesale rewrite this to get it back through the Senate, could be months. There's certain problems. Things on the ground have changed significantly since they passed it. How do we get the coalition of people to support the supplemental and pass it? The easiest, best thing to do is to pass the Senate bill, which got 70 votes, remember, a very bipartisan piece of legislation in these really tough times. I think everyone was quite surprised at the group that passed it, the majority that we got for that bill. That would go right to the president's desk and get signed. I mean, it could be done by the end of the weekend, even if we do it Friday. So that is the best way forward. And that is, when you look at how he's chopping up the bill, like I said, there are a couple additions into the bill. Some of them I'm for, the TikTok legislation. However, it doesn't really markedly change the bill and what we're trying to do here: fund Ukraine, fund Israel and humanitarian aid for Gaza, fund Indo-Pacific. I mean, these are the areas of the world where we want to make sure we can support our allies. So this sort of chop up the bill plan doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. However, I think we're all very desperate to get support for Ukraine passed, given what a threat they are facing right now. So how do I see the next year playing out? Well, I'm praying we get Ukraine funding done this week in some way, shape, or form, and figure out how to get it, if we need to, pass the Senate as quickly as possible. Because there, as you're talking about possible negotiations in the future with Russia, someone said to me when we hadn't passed the supplemental, well, why don't we just negotiate for peace? And I said, why would Putin negotiate for peace right now? It's really, whether or not we're funding Ukraine is really, I think we're all waiting to see that. We're working incredibly hard. But if you were Vladimir Putin, what incentive would you have to come to the table right now when you're waiting to see if support from democratic nations can hold? Of course, you're going to wait until you determine that. So what we need to do is certainly pass the supplemental. We are working. Remember, Ukraine has still kept the Eastern manufacturing industrial base area. Russia bombed out quite large portions of it, but they are setting up manufacturing. That's where 90% of the Soviet munitions were manufactured. They do have a lot of expertise. So setting up the manufacturing there, they are producing some of their own munitions, working to ensure they have more of a capacity there. They are still managing to get grain out despite the Russians trying to block that. So they're still able to feed large parts of Africa, which is important to Africa, but also to the economy of Ukraine. So there are pieces of good news here for the Ukrainians. They still have Kyiv, which we thought would be overrun within days. They still, like I said, have the port of Odessa with the grain shipments going out. So they still have really key and critical pieces of their country. So I do see it being critically important that we pass the supplemental so we can give the Ukrainians the tools they need to hold their country together. Yeah. And then once that's done, I think we can reassess the state on the ground. And are there leverage points to really push back at Russia? Remember, this is harming their economy. They've lost an incredible amount of people in this war. They've really tried to keep a lot of that outside of, sort of middle class ethnic majorities, and they've gone to the ethnic minorities to recruit from. They've gone to the prisons to recruit from there. They've really tried to keep it away from large portions of the Republican population, but they're running out of people. So what is that going to mean to them going forward? They're now negotiating with other countries to get their weapons to fight this war. Their own munitions base isn't keeping up. So they've really, they've had some, without a navy, Ukraine has been successful at attacking the Russian Navy. So I think there's a lot of signs that this has really weakened Russia. So what is that going to mean once we are able to get the supplemental pass, fund Ukraine? Then what is the state of play going to be?
Right. Well, the will to fight is one thing, and it's the will to fund at the moment that is, I think, in serious jeopardy. And that's going to affect whatever plans there would be for any sort of Ukrainian offensive, not this year, but probably in 2025. It's hugely concerning. On the same point, 75th anniversary of NATO. Where are you on Ukrainian membership?
So, speaking of NATO,
Yeah, and New Jersey, I'm going to interrupt. New Jersey, I think, has probably the largest American Ukrainian population in the country. Is that correct? Or among the largest?
Of New Jersey, New York metropolitan area, that's correct. So in my district, for example, we have the Cultural Center in Whippany, so very, very strong Ukrainian presence in New Jersey. So, I think you bring up something really important when you refer to NATO. If the United States can't support Ukraine, and as we're leading the NATO nations in support of Ukraine, and if we can't provide that, then there's a real argument as to what are we doing with NATO? If the United States is going to abdicate a leadership position here, if the United States isn't going to lead on Ukraine, supporting a democratic nation with our NATO allies, if we're going to step away from that, then there's a real question, because we know that under the Trump administration, without U.S. leadership, no one really stepped into the breach for various reasons. NATO needs and requires U.S. leadership. And so if we are going to step away from that leadership position, it really does call into question how NATO is going to move forward. And I'll tell you, we often say in our military, we never fight alone. That's because we always have our friends and allies fighting with us. That has been a key thing of U.S. success for decades now. So to think that we might walk away from our most strategic alliance in the world and our longest serving strategic alliance, it's really, it would really be striking, and I think a huge blow to U.S. power and security. That said, I think we're in agreement that Ukraine should be moving forward to entering into NATO in the future. I think that's something we are discussing with our NATO allies because we will act together if that is the decision. But certainly, I think they should be a part of NATO.
Yeah, a comparison has been made in view of recent events, specifically Iran strikes against Israel with 350 missiles of varying ranges and lethalities. That this is what Ukraine faces every day, or frequently. And more than a few pundits have raised the question, well, why do you see this coalition forged and come to Israel's defense when in fact Ukraine is subject to this from the Russians? The obvious answer is that there's a different threat perception here, right? I mean, deploying U.S. forces into Ukraine risks what the Biden administration has been trying to avoid. I think it was the president's prime directive: avoid World War III. Those are the president's own words. Do you accept the logic that, well, again, I'll put it out there. Have we been too risk averse when it comes to the issue of support for Ukraine as a consequence of legitimate and genuine fears? I mean, nobody wants Americans deployed in Ukraine.
Right.
American forces.
I don't think we needed to deploy Americans in Ukraine, but yes, we've certainly been too risk averse in Ukraine. What was that line of Churchill's that Americans always come to the right decision after they've exhausted all other possibilities. I feel like that has been our supply of Ukraine throughout the entire war. We come to the right decision, but it takes us too long. We don't move the correct munitions in, the correct weapons in, the correct platforms in as quickly as we should be using them. And some people have called it self-deterrence, which has sometimes been the case. So I do think we have been too risk averse in many ways in Ukraine. Certainly now, I think we're at a point where we understand what we need to do. And I think we are fairly aligned in the national security community about what that is. We just have to get the supplemental passed so we can do it and execute.
Right. We're nearing the end of our 45 minutes. So I want to ask you a question about the Middle East. The focus has now shifted from Gaza to Iran. How are you looking at American policy toward Iran these days?
So I think, we have several adversaries across the world that are really, I'd almost say key adversaries in our fight for democracy and human rights. And Iran is one of them, the largest funder of terrorism throughout the Middle East and beyond. We see we see threats to American interests, including shutting down the Red Sea, and all that entails with our global supply chains. And so you see this actor that has tried to push back against U.S. interests and push back against U.S. Beliefs in democracy and democratic values, making such headway. And so I think that is why there is hope, though, for a better future in the region for the Palestinian people. Because as I said to Netanyahu, you have to come up with a vision for a two-state solution, because I think there's a sense that the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Gulf states are very interested. I'm sorry, that's the vote bell. But are, I know, coming close, but are very interested in working with, I think that's it. Nope. And I think you see, okay. I think you see many states in the region very interested in working for or working towards a more secure future and looking beyond a fossil fuel economy, in understanding what technology could be created out of the region to help the economy. I think you're also seeing countries more interested in opening up to the world. When we look back at the 1960s, the sort of threat Israel provided, that the Saudis used that to consolidate their population and think internally. Now we're looking at a world where the Saudis want to open up more, where other states in the region want to become more global players. And Israel is a key figure in that, but there's not a pathway forward in the region without understanding the future of the Palestinian people. I don't think the populations of many of these countries are going to move forward if the Palestinian people are still suffering as they are now. So thinking strategically about how we're going to push back against Iran, I think you've really got to start looking towards the future and how you are going to create a safe and secure Israel, and how you are going to create a safe and secure future for the Palestinian people. And that's, to me, the only path forward there is a two-state solution.
Do you have time for one more question, or do you have to go vote?
One more question.
Iraq and Afghanistan were the two longest wars in American history. They were fought by a volunteer military, and most people I talk to are not serious about reinstating the draft. Volunteer military may be cost effective. In a professional military, I think that's important. But I guess, I had the feeling throughout Iraq and Afghanistan that the military was at war, but not the country. And the question is, less than 1% of the country fighting the two longest wars in American history. It would point up the crying need, in my sense, if you want to promote some sense of national identity in a country that seems to be more atomized than ever without one, you need some sort of program for national service, discretionary, mandatory. And I guess I may have to have you back on the program again to talk about. It's a complicated issue, but a thought or two.
So I'm a member of the Four Country Caucus, which is a bipartisan group of veterans in the House of Representatives. And we've been focused on national service and what that looks like. And not just military service, but
Right.
Teach for America, Public Health Corps, different areas where people across the country could serve. And I think you're exactly right. It's really not healthy for our military to be so separate from our population. I think you have almost a warrior class, if you will, of people who understand what it is to fight these wars and who are paying the price for them and largely shielding the rest of the population. And I think it possibly makes people too quick to go into war, too quick to enter into some of these engagements, a lack of understanding. I said, I was talking about casualty numbers to one friend of mine, and his take on it was, well, that's the cost of war. And,
Right.
I'm like, gosh, I don't think people who haven't served maybe understand the difference between 1,000 people dying and 30,000 people dying and
Right.
what that might mean in the time frame. I just don't think they've experienced that. And so I think it is really important that we do consider more broadly national service.
Congresswoman Sherrill, I want to thank you for coming on Carnegie Connects, but I want to thank you even more. You're the living embodiment, frankly, of this sort of selfless, irrespective of party considerations, selfless sort of public servant that the country needs. And I appreciate that. And I'm sure there are many, many, many Americans, regardless of what political affiliation they are, that appreciate it as well. So thanks again.
Very flattering. Thank you very much.
Good luck with the vote. Good luck with the vote.
Thank you. Thank you
Take
so
care.
much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.